So yes, I'm Sarah Peers, and yes, I'm here representing the Women's Engineering Society, which is nearly 100 years old. So what I'm going to be talking about today will be really focusing on engineering, construction, technology, and perhaps some of the strategies. And I think this is sort of, it's crossing what Sarah Jackson has been talking about, because I think we've got slightly different strategies here, but flexible working is actually a really good strategy that we should be looking at as well. Why women in engineering and all the rest of it? Actually, it's just basically the numbers are so low. It's you know, here in the UK in particular, they're very low compared to other countries, in other countries where they're desperately trying to do something about it. And people sometimes say, well, you know, but it's changing, isn't it? Well, this is a graph of women engineers, professional women engineers from 2007 to 2014. So it's not changing, really. It is, you know, that's much better than it was 30 years ago, but it's very slow indeed. And in some areas, in digital technologies, the number of women is dropping, in effect. Fascinating, you know, sort of background to all of this, sociological, etc., and historical. But what about pay? What does this mean, that the fact that there's so few women in engineering and technology? I mean, is it any different to any other sector? Well, it turns out that it's different in each of the engineering, construction, and digital technology sectors. And not that different to some other sectors, such as education and finance. And are the solutions somewhat different? Well, the job conditions can be rather different in engineering and construction and technology. There's often project-based work. And that means things like flexible working is sometimes really difficult for employers to put into place. There's sometimes some performance-related pay, and that has a big impact on women because there's all sorts of biases around what we consider to be good performance. And those biases, I mean that good performance is measured differently for different types of people. It's important that we realize that this idea of science, technology, engineering, mathematics has an impact on general gender pay. There's, on the general gender pay gap. There's reports to say, actually, it's because women don't choose the highly productive jobs, the technical jobs, and that's why the gender pay gap is there. We know now from the reporting that's not necessarily true. But this idea of choice is rather interesting, because I'm not sure that it is about choice. And actually, but it is true that in regions where there are high numbers of people working in some of the STEM areas, you do have a high gender pay gap. A high gender pay gap actually means that women's work is undervalued, and women in those organisations where there's a gender pay gap feel undervalued, and that in turn means that women go off and do the work that is normally considered to be women's work, like hairdressing and teaching and nursing, all very low paid jobs, and that sort of has an impact again on the general gender pay gap generally. So we have to do something about the STEM jobs to try and remove some of that issue and to give women the opportunity to earn the same as men do, particularly in regions where there are lots of science, engineering, and technology. And the issues do vary. Engineering, and I'll go for the big four from which everything else goes, which is civil, mechanical, chemical, electrical. Gender pay gap actually does GDP, sorry, that should be gender pay gap, obviously, does widen at director level, but it starts at trades level. So metal forming, that's sort of really technical, it's highly skilled jobs, by the way, but really, you know, the sort of bottom layer of many organisations. The gender pay gap is at least 21%. If you go to construction, we've found in some companies, the gender pay gap can be as high as 45% for people working as supervisors. And there's very, very few women working on sites. But those jobs are very well paid. In technology, we're finding that women tend to work in facilitating roles, and they're not paid as well as the coding, hacking roles. So roles in digital technology tends to be genderized. So is it changing? I asked that earlier and they said, no, it's not. Well, no, it's not. So one issue is unconscious bias. I'd like to highlight the fact that there have been lots of work looking at, for example, scientists being employed, same CV, different name on it, and universities have actually gone on to say, no, we're more likely to employ the man, even though it's exactly the same CV, and not only that, but we'll pay them more at the very beginning of their careers. And when it comes to leadership, of course, there's another bias there in terms of who we consider to be leaders, who managers consider to be leaders. Some of these biases, you might say, well, they're only slight impact, but actually they have a big impact as you go along your career path and as you go negotiating your salaries. Women negotiate less, but they're perceived to be much more aggressive when they do. And this sort of idea of accumulated pay disparity happens in all sectors. One thing we can learn from some of the engineering sectors is that sometimes roles are, there's a highly structured career path, so sometimes you don't get this accumulated pay disparity quite early on. So this is a nice graph from The Guardian, and look, there's construction, really bad gender pay gap, on average 25% gender pay gap. And then we go down to digital, and yeah, it's number sort of 4 on the list. And then there's engineers in mining, electricity and gas, professional and scientific technical activities, manufacturing, transportation and storage, agriculture and forestry. So the engineers up here are really having a bad time of it. But is this gender pay gap real? It's either an equal pay, or it's just that there's a lack of women leaders, and that's why the gender pay gap, the gender pay looks low. Well, John and Jane might be doing the same job, but you will get a difference in pay because John has negotiated, because experience and time served, time lapsed, being in the job for longer, because a woman might be more likely to take a career break, that again has an impact on your salary. So it might be the same job, but you're still being paid less. And we know that there's biases and bonuses and performance pay, and then part-time pay. I'm hoping somebody at some point has talked about part-time pay, but the big difficulty there is nobody ever gets a pay rise when they're in part-time work. There's lots of Johns in the senior team, and then more Janes in facilitating non-leadership roles. Well, what if there's no gender pay gap reported? Because we have seen some companies and reasonable companies, sorry, I'm just going to say, some companies where they're saying there's no gender pay gap or even a positive gender pay gap. Well, there could be all sorts of reasons for that. Maybe there's just many more women in mid-level roles and none in technician craft roles. Now, this is where the mathematician in me came up. I started to look at this. So we're comparing means. We're comparing 2 distribution graphs, distribution graph of the salaries for men, distribution graph of salaries for women. Well, you might think that no gender pay gap, or even a positive gender pay gap, could mean that everything's fine and dandy. Well, assume the case that you've got a company where there's 10 women earning 20,000, so their mean and median is the same, 20,000. Take it from me, I know statistics, okay? You've got 100 men earning 15,000, so they're in the sort of trades, technical roles maybe. 5 men earning 25,000, 5 men earning 50,000. Now that to me is not a very well balanced organization, but there are many engineering companies like this. Actually, their median and means actually show that women seem to be earning more. It's this sort of situation where you've got men in leadership, men doing quite a few of the roles directing other people, some women in a lot of women in facilitating roles, hence the 20,000, and a few women, it's very, very typical of manufacturing. That looks good, doesn't it? But that's not the reality. So you do need to know a bit of maths to understand what's going on. So what needs to change? Talked about communication. Absolutely. One of the anecdotes that we're getting is that where organizations are trying to tackle some of the gender issues in engineering, because women are so far and few between, it becomes really obvious when a woman gets promoted, when a woman is recruited. And suddenly you get them sort of murmurings from people, well, you know, this is all positive discrimination, isn't it? We're desperately trying to get women there and make it. So actually you do need to communicate with them to say, hey, look, in that time that we promoted this one woman, actually another 20 men were promoted. And they really need to hear that. Pay and bonuses. Well, lessons from other countries. Also lessons from these highly structured career paths that some engineering companies have. Don't allow negotiating. Make sure you've got transparent pay structures. That really makes a difference. And there are certain countries where the gender pay gaps are very low, Finland, for example, where they have very open, transparent, everybody knows, or everybody can find out what everybody else is earning. And make sure that your pay is based on the role, not on your time-lapsed, served, apprenticeship, etc., but actually the role that the performance that you're supposed to be providing. And your processes need to remove and avoid all biases in assessment, because we know bonuses are based on subjective measures, and there's a huge gender pay gap or gender disparity in bonuses. And we've got to avoid genderized roles, which we do have. We're getting them even in the very technical roles. And I think we mentioned culture change. So next steps, I think actually in gender pay gap reporting, we need to actually be splitting up the reporting. We need to look at pay bands, we need to look at roles, we need to look at levels in each organization, because then those sort of, zero gender pay gaps will, suddenly become obvious why they're there. In the meantime, though, I think there'll be lots of organizations saying, no, we can't do things like no negotiating, no, you can't have complete pay transparency. So actually what do you do instead? Well, they're communicating what these issues really mean, but then you do need some empowering networks, and hence organizations like the Women's Engineering Society exists. Because those networks can be the networks that can support individuals with their negotiating, make sure that those roles let women get to technical leadership positions, and they provide collective voices with men as well. Just a final quick word about WES, 100 years next year. One of the things that we're doing is collecting up 100 good, even best practice case studies that we can share with companies. And of course, many of them will be around gender pay, we hope. Our campaign will be about making sure that we get 30% of women at all levels in all areas of technical work by 2030. Thank you very much.
Thank you.